So here we are in 2015. We are now on the 12th Nexus device, and this isn't even counting other Google push products such as the Motorola Xoom and the G1. We have seen Android grow exponentially since its debut. This open source operating system has seen adoption at an unbelievable rate. Where we are today is a very exciting place. And this journey, it all started with the T-Mobile G1. The G1 was Google's first foray into the smartphone game, and it had big competition from the outset. The G1 wasn't set out to be an iPhone killer. If anything, it tried to differentiate itself to an alternate user base, a crowd that inevitably found itself being slightly more technical. It was a modder's paradise. The Android OS represented something different, something new, and most importantly, open. Perceptibly, the screen didn't compare to the iPhone of the time, but hardware decisions such as the SD card slot and slide-out keyboard gave people a choice. The interface was quite basic, but boy did it have some unique features. We had a home screen with widgets. Aesthetically speaking, it was one of the defining features of early Android stories. They were interactive little tidbits which presented glanceable information without opening the app. The G1 debuted with the OS codenamed Cupcake, Google's playful nature of naming its OS versions after well-known desserts. Donut eventually made its way to the G1, and if you were into routing, you could have got much further than that. In addition, the Android market was another compelling feature which allowed any developer to publish their app. This openness was in stark contrast to Apple, who took a very different stance. On the whole, the OS seemed less restrictive and more experimental for those who wanted something more than just a phone. It had a single core CPU which, by today's standards, is punitive, but for its time it was powerful, and even using it now doesn't feel as bad as it probably should. The slide-out keyboard worked well and gave a tactile feedback, and that thunk of which the keyboard slid out was an incredibly pleasing piece of workmanship. This wasn't just a phone, it was the start of something quite special, and whether this was just an experiment, it paved the way for Google's ambition with Android. In 2010, January 5th, the Nexus One came, which brought along it the ethos of what we see today. It was the showcase platform, a reference device of sorts for developers and OEMs to take note and orbit their designs around. Google wanted to show what could and should be possible. It was based on the original incarnation of the HTC Desire and featured an 800 by 480 resolution screen with what felt like normal then, a trackball. It featured 4 capacitive buttons on the front, and it also featured a micro SD card slot for storage expansion. The Nexus One debuted with Bluetooth 2.1 and the ability to perform voice-guided turn-by-turn navigation. We saw Android 2.1 Eclair, which featured software enhancements to the contact, email, messaging, and camera systems. We soon saw an update to Android 2.2, codenamed Froyo. There was Adobe Flash support, Wi-Fi tethering, and also the ability to install apps to the SD card. This feature alone was long awaited and much needed. It wasn't all positives though. The phone was based on the HTC Desire, which arguably had a more developed front end with its Sense UI. Not only that, it chose to go down traditional carrier routes, which the Nexus One did not. It could be said that this is where the Nexus One probably fell short. We can see that it slowly gained momentum, but people were quick to write it off as a failure. However, the Nexus One surely did make an impact on the market in one way or another, and this was only just the beginning. Soon after, based on the Samsung Galaxy S, came the Nexus S. Google decided to switch from HTC to spread the love, as it were, among the many OEMs that were fighting the Android fight. It was pretty and unassuming, and despite being plastic throughout, it felt good in the hand. The phone launched on the 16th of December 2010 in the US and a few days later in the UK. However, only in March the following year did we see the phone on a carrier. We saw Android 2.3 codenamed Gingerbread, and NFC was the spotlight feature on the Nexus S. 2.3 also brought along with it a more streamlined interface, a new keyboard along with a host of back-end features. The phone, however, did not come without its drawbacks. The camera lacked 720p recording, which at the time was found on comparable devices. It wasn't just that though, the phone lacked expandable storage. It's a fairly common omission nowadays, even though it's coming back as a premium, but back then most devices did, and it was surely one of the best things about Android handsets. Given this, the fact that the phone was priced at $529 offline, it seemed a bit high. Fans and critics were keen to point out that the device really didn't offer much over the Nexus One. Regardless, it brought along a bigger 4-inch Super AMOLED display but at the same 800 by 480 resolution. Along with small hardware upgrades, the important thing here was that it addressed the internal storage. It offered more for applications and got the partitions right. Android was becoming stronger and stronger, and some may say this is where things really started. Samsung found themselves in a strong position, offering something similar but different from the iPhone. Some loved it, some didn't understand it, and Google inevitably found themselves along for the ride in the lawsuits that defined the tech landscape that decade. That didn't stop Google from sticking with Samsung for a second go though. This advocated the popularity that Samsung was slowly starting to gain. With that, we saw the aptly named Galaxy Nexus. The phone was announced with a slight delay in respect to the passing of Steve Jobs. It launched in November 2011. Technically, we were starting to enter a really exciting place. The race we were experiencing during this time was like no other. Every bump in clock speed, every increase in pixel count had an extreme significance on the functionality of a mobile phone. We found ourselves with a unique hardware design. The previous two Nexus devices were variants of existing ones. The Galaxy Nexus featured a dragon tail front which saw a slight curvature to it. This gave it a unique look and a sense of class. The display was a huge 4.65 inches with a 720p Super AMOLED display. Screens were to slowly get bigger and bigger. It launched alongside the highly anticipated Android 4.0, which was also known as Ice Cream Sandwich. For the first time, we saw no capacitive buttons. As usual, the Nexus was the first device to push this reference. To complete the design, it featured a pleasing ambient notification LED, which was something missing on its predecessor. Samsung were doing considerably well with the Galaxy S2, and with Google's push with ICS, the Galaxy Nexus proved to be an exciting device. Let's not forget Android 4.0 was a big change. It aimed to unify the design with a tablet-only honeycomb in a form that would be functional on the smaller screen. The UI was modernized under the name Holo. It was cleaner and revolved around a new typeface named Roboto. ICS brought along Android Beam, lock screen widgets, the questionable but novel face unlock, and the ability to limit mobile data. Subjectively, ICS was awesome. It was a Tron-esque looking device which appealed to the so-called geeks. The Galaxy Nexus ran the OS well and proved to be a good reference device to launch with. The lack of expandable storage continued, which was slowly becoming the industry standard. It seems as though Google were finally joining the rest. Google still kept selling the device through the Play Store, but soon they partnered with the US carriers such as Sprint and Verizon. In Europe, it launched on O2 and Vodafone but lacked Google Wallet. You may also remember the Galaxy Nexus suffered a brief sales ban, which was due to the ongoing battle between Samsung and Apple. Regardless of whether the device was a high seller or not, there was no doubt that the new software features made the Galaxy Nexus a compelling device for those looking for an interesting, bloat-free device showcasing a great and flexible OS. There were some slight negatives such as the battery life and the poor camera, but the positives always seem to outweigh the negatives. The next device was a new chapter for Google, and it represented a new time in the mobile space. Google partnered with a new OEM, and this change was needed to widen the reach of Android. The speculation was high, really high, and with the delayed announcement due to Hurricane Sandy, it made things fever pitch. The Nexus 4 was unveiled on October 29, 2012, and it was coming from LG. At the time, it was quite surprising, but LG was on the up. It brought serious style at a price point which sat comfortable with a lot of wallets. We had $299 for the 8GB version and $349 for the 16. This was much lower than comparable devices which were costing around $600. Things only got more exciting when we saw that it offered a Snapdragon S4 Pro quad-core processor. This clocked in at 1.5 GHz and it had 2 GB of RAM, which all ran on a lovely 720p IPS display. This seemingly quiet but beautiful device propelled the Nexus program into the mainstream. The front sported a glass panel which was slightly curved on the edges, and the back featured a chatoyance effect. It looked stunning and showcased a different design language, but more importantly, it proved that great design wasn't limited to higher priced phones. As classy and premium as the glass construction made the device feel, it also vocalized some niggles. Both glass panels were covered in Corning Gorilla Glass 2, but that didn't stop people from finding their devices were starting to see scratches and cracks. Once again, we saw an underwhelming shooter. We had an 8-megapixel camera, but it was lacking any form of quality from the sensor. In addition, we were slowly starting to see Google take more control of the devices. The 4 followed other devices in the market and offered no removable battery. This was obviously a cause for concern for die-hard Android fans that had been used to a certain form of usage. This argument was countered with the relatively low price and echoed the saying, "You can't have it all." After the initial launch, the device sold out quick. Google couldn't restock quick enough and fell into manufacturing issues, and so the Nexus 4 stayed sold out for a long time. The success here could have been potentially very different had this not been the case. Android 4.2 debuted with the Nexus 4. We saw quick settings on the notification system, we had gesture typing and the novel ability to take photospheres. Within a year, the price dropped by $100. It was astonishing to realize what you could get with the amount you were paying for. We hadn't really seen anything like this before, and coming from a brand name, it gave confidence. Overall, the Nexus 4 was a sign of the ecosystem that Google was trying to build, and also an indication of what was to come for both hardware and software. LG stayed for another round, and this time expectations were high. We were now at a point where the Nexus brand was the be-all and end-all for Android enthusiasts. The Nexus 5 was available from the Google Play Store for $299 for the 16 and $349 for the 32, which was surely increased by $50. It was slightly thinner, slightly lighter, and had a slightly larger screen. This was a refinement that felt natural, as if Google wanted to make the same formula more efficient and lean with the second go. We had a polycarbonate shell which was vastly different from the N4. The phone was beautiful, but in a way that was understated, subtle, and probably more sophisticated than the N4. The device was based on the LG G2, but in actual fact it wasn't all that similar. It had a smaller display, a smaller battery, but more importantly, it didn't keep the panels self-refresh. Regardless, at this point, being a Nexus device, it had unique selling points that other phones really could not match. Google had once again delivered a high caliber phone at a lower price. There was no real competition. The phone shipped with the Snapdragon 800 SoC, and it was also the first Nexus device to officially have 4G, which curiously was not found on a Nexus 4 unless you entered a secret menu. As with previous Nexus devices, the 5 was the showcase phone for Android 4.4, which went by KitKat. If we had faults to find in the devices throughout the years, there was no doubt that the software was only going from strength to strength. Google had tightened up the very nature of the ecosystem and introduced new APIs. This made Android much more memory efficient, now only needing 512 MB of RAM to run. This was essential to Google's aim of getting Android into developing countries. KitKat also introduced a host of new features. We saw screen recording, system-wide support for closed captioning, audio tunneling, composite sensor support, and much more. The N5 was also the first to sport the Google Now launcher. This was the first major sign of Google focusing their attention on user experience, as launchers on previous devices were bare bones to say the least. We also had Google Now, an excellent card-based system which provided ultra-rich notifications. The Nexus 5 exhibited similar issues to a number of previous Nexus devices, and that was a relatively poor camera. It was better than its predecessor, as you'd expect, but poor in comparison to a number of different devices out there. Again, we looked past its faults due to the relatively low price point. There's arguments to be made regarding the exact purpose of the Nexus line of devices. Like with any embryonic form, there was always going to be changes, some good, some bad, and some just questionable, like the marketing and distribution. Either way, what started out as a handy reference device for developers soon began to attract widespread appeal. And why not? It was at a lower price point but featured an uncluttered interface and timely updates. Tablets have been a completely different game for Google. Before anything even started, they were playing catch up with the iPad and its dominance. We never really thought anything of the iPad initially, but it proved that there was a market for an alternative to a laptop, which wasn't necessarily for productivity, but definitely for consumption. Smartphones were ill-equipped, so Google decided to showcase its tablet-optimized version of Android with the release of the Motorola Xoom. Announced at CES 2011, it featured Android 3.0 titled Honeycomb. It was a vastly different experience to anything that we were used to. It featured a new design language which we would see as the inspiration for future versions of Android. We saw support for multi-core processors, copy and paste, and new connectivity options such as Bluetooth keyboards. Honeycomb wasn't just a tablet OS, it was an indication of where things were going. People were keen to point out that Android did not contain many tablet-optimized apps. They were coming, and here we had an insightful and daring look into what Google had planned for their tablets. We saw an influx of tablets from all sorts of companies and OEMs, as they finally had a capable OS to run on a larger screen. Advent, Samsung, ZTE, Toshiba, and Amazon were all in the mix. The next year saw Google announce the Nexus 7, a curiously small 7-inch tablet. It was made in conjunction with the Zeus, and it was the first tablet to carry the Nexus branding. It featured an unusual form factor and came very friendly to the wallets of potential buyers. At $199, it was the cheapest way of entering the Nexus family, and for that you got an NVIDIA Tegra 3 processor paired with 1GB of RAM, all running on a 1280x700 IPS LCD display. Through what was a rigorous design and production process, Google and Asus managed to release a tablet which propelled the Nexus brand to widespread knowledge. It put the 7-inch form factor into the spotlight. We had a tablet that was relatively portable, but encompassed a lot of technology for its relative size and weight. The design saw a plastic chassis which was supported by a Corning scratch-resistant thick glass. It had a dimpled plastic surface with a rubbery, leathery texture on the back. With this, Google debuted Android 4.1, codenamed Jelly Bean. The aim here was user experience, and in that, the GUI elements were now slightly more relaxed. The pull-down notification area was improved and now adjusted to various screen sizes. We saw multiple improvements under the hood, and the ever-present lag was the main priority. This resolution took form as Project Butter. In addition, Google pushed forth their ecosystem. They put their store front and center of the device, offering a free film, ebook, several magazines, and a $25 credit to spend in Google Play. Chrome was also now the default browser, making the overall system tighter. Some loved this, some not so much. The argument here was that Google was slowly taking more control to an OS that was natively meant to be open. It could be argued that the Nexus 7 was the first device to have mass consumer appeal. It had finally brought a device which did not just appeal to Android enthusiasts, but something which had the hardware, had the price, but more importantly had the ecosystem to finally start matching its competitors. Later that year, looking to build on the Nexus 7 and not to disappoint users of larger tablets, Google announced and released the Nexus 10. Built in conjunction with Samsung, it featured an outstanding 2560x1600 resolution screen, all running on a 10.1-inch PLS backlit LCD. It featured a Samsung Exynos 5250 with a Mali T604 GPU. It featured Android 4.2, and gone was the honeycomb navbar and menu. We were now back to 3 standard icons in the center of the screen. This perhaps wasn't the most sensible decision considering it wasn't in reach of either hand during operation. The Nexus 10 featured the usual connections, but an interesting addition was the micro HDMI. Great for media enthusiasts, but hampered due to the lack of expandable storage. Regardless, it offered a way to mirror the display at a time where Chromecast and similar devices weren't around. The tablet also featured great front-facing speakers. Critically, the Nexus 10 received mixed but generally positive reviews. It was praised for the sheer resolution of the screen. There were questions regarding whether the device had the longevity to run the display, but with a 9000 mAh battery, 9 hours of video playback and 7 of web browsing were claimed. All of this equal to the Nexus 10 retailing at $399 for the 16 and $499 for the 32. This was probably not what we were expecting considering the recent history of lower prices, but it was still cheaper than the then current iPad. Despite this, the Nexus 10 was sold out within hours of its release on the Play Store, and what feels like repetition now, we ran into stock problems. You'd expect Google to be efficient considering the scale of their reach. Given the newfound popularity of the 7-inch form factor, it was only a matter of time before Google released a successor to the Nexus 7. Google would have missed an opportunity had they not followed up, but they did. And we saw the release on July 26th in the US and 28th of August in the UK with the Nexus 7 2013. The partnership remained and the ethos stayed. We had a better screen with an increased color gamut and contrast ratio. The resolution was now up to 1920x1200 from the original 1280x800. We saw a new SoC in the Snapdragon S4 Pro and doubled the RAM of the original. Due to better component choice and further software optimizations, we saw much better battery life despite the Nexus 7 2013 containing a smaller battery. We now had a design which reflected Google's confidence. There was no conflicting elements and the entire device was black and featured a soft touch plastic backing. The whole package was a slimmer and more sophisticated attempt. It was a clear representation of what we would see with the Nexus 5, 6 and 9. Still codenamed Jelly Bean, we saw Android 4.3. We had restricted profiles for tablets, Bluetooth Low Energy, and on the software side we had faster user switching, lower latency for controls, and the ability to wirelessly display content. This improvement resulted in a slightly higher price. We saw the Nexus 7 2013 debut at $229 for the 16 and $269 for the 32. This increase in price was justified by a much better product overall. And that brings us to the now, and with what Google must see as the future of the Nexus initiative. We have the Nexus 6 and 9. The context is intriguing, confusing, and exciting all at the same time. For the first time, we see a difference in the very nature of what we believe the Nexus branding represents. If we consider the price, it has gone against everything we have witnessed throughout the history of the Nexus program. The devices have generally focused on great specs, but at a lower price. And with the Nexus 9 and 6, we have definitely entered the premium territory. In this space, there are no excuses for underperforming hardware or non-functioning software. This is where we start to question the depth of the software and Google's overall intention.
OEMs such as Samsung, HTC, and Sony offer their skins on top of Android, but there are features there that could possibly be justified more so than the Nexus devices. Features such as IP certification for water and dust proofing, camera and camera apps with the option for manual control, expandable storage, and so much more. Vanilla Android does not offer this inherently, so when you're paying the premium, what counts as a justification when other devices offer more?
The air of premium firstly comes in the feeling, and here they do absolutely fine. The Nexus 6 and 9 both incorporate materials which command this feeling instantly. The 6 sees itself with a subtle metal frame with a big, bold screen. The back, however, is a different story and probably the biggest issue with the design. We have a slippery plastic, which is a very confusing design choice. The premium feeling, oddly enough, also comes in its heft. The 6 feels heavy, but as it's big, this weight gives it solidity. The 9 follows suit. It's a big device and keeps the design language and materials of the 5. These are fine looking and feeling devices, but more importantly, they now come with top tier specs throughout. The 6 comes with a beautiful 2560 by 1440 AMOLED display. The color isn't the most accurate, displaying a slight green tint, but it doesn't draw anything away from the sheer number of pixels on the screen. We all question the significance of having anything higher than a 1080p display, and even 720 at one point, but the difference is noticeable. In addition, the Nexus 6 has amazing onboard speakers. Subjectively, it's one of the best around. We are seeing more devices coming out with front-facing speakers, and it's confusing to think why it took so long for OEMs to include this. The Nexus 9 follows suit and comes in with an equally good 2048 by 1536 IPS display. It too has great onboard speakers, which only should be expected considering the price. But with the 9 in particular, we have to question whether overall it makes the best use of the components it has. Android on tablets has always been a contentious point regarding tablet optimized apps and the UI on a larger screen. Subjectively, there was something magical with their previous tablet efforts. The UI made great use of the space. However, since the release of the Nexus 7, we have seen the tablet and phone UI merge. It worked well on the 7, but probably not so much on the 9. More and more applications are making great use of the space available, but it's a shame the OS doesn't. Not as much as it used to anyways. The 9 comes with the state-of-the-art Tegra K1 processor, which is famed for its GPU power. With all the talk of this chipset, we see nothing on the Nexus 9 that arguably makes use of this power. We have to even question whether this is even needed. In comparison, the Tegra Shield tablet contains the same chipset, but here it's arguably justified. We have game streaming, console mode, 4K output, and lots more. This is complemented on the hardware side with a micro HDMI slot, expandable storage, and baked-in stylus support. This makes compelling justification of this chipset, and all at a price point lower than a Nexus 9. So it's somewhat underwhelming. We must hope that Google have some great ideas in mind with the hardware they have given the Nexus 9. Android 5.0 is the shining star in all of this though. The rate of evolution has been unbelievable, and what we have today is a great OS. There's a new design language deemed material design, and for once, every interaction and animation makes great sense and seems to have a purpose. It's more colorful, more fluent in its approach, and overall will appeal to a wider audience. Underneath, we have the all-new Art runtime, which is faster and more efficient. Nexus devices have always been reference devices which have been heavily developer driven.
The devices provided a form of Android without any customizations or additions, which were paired with timely updates to new software versions.
Where we are heading with the software is somewhat nebulous, as everything is becoming more streamlined and the gap between stock and AOSP is only growing. OEMs are now starting to offer compelling reasons for sticking with their ecosystem. They're also offering features and functions that some users may genuinely want. In comparison, paying a premium for devices that offer a stock experience may not be as enthralling as it once was. So, there is no doubt that we are in a good place right now. The Android Silver program has also seemingly disappeared, so the future is just as confusing as it is exciting. There is no doubt though, where we are and with the technology available, these are the greatest devices to come out of the Nexus program. If it wasn't for this, the software really wouldn't be what it is today. Developers have created and enthusiasts have modded and hacked their way through the fruition of Android. We have seen ROMs, kernels, enhancements, tweaked scripts, themes, and much more that really can't be described. The Nexus program has only been the catalyst for this.
This has been Ash for Android Authority. Thank you so much for listening and stay tuned because we will always be your source for all things Android.